There is a moment in every war when a weapon that once defined military supremacy quietly becomes a liability. And most of the time, the army still using that weapon doesn't realize it until the battlefield is already littered with its wreckage. Russia is living through that moment right now. If you've been following this channel, subscribe and hit that bell, because what we're about to break down is not just a story about tanks. It's a story about the collapse of a strategic doctrine that took 70 years to build, and the psychological terror of realizing mid-conflict that the weapons you've built your entire military identity around can be destroyed by something a soldier carries in a backpack. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of this war, the beginning of the idea. The tank was born in the trenches of the First World War, a machine designed to do one thing: break stalemates, to cross no man's land under fire, crush barbed wire, absorb bullets, and punch through lines that infantry alone couldn't crack. It was terrifying, revolutionary, and it worked. Within 2 decades, military strategists around the world had reorganized entire armies around the concept of armored warfare. By the time the Second World War erupted, the tank wasn't just a weapon, it was the weapon, the symbol of mechanized dominance, the centerpiece of every major offensive doctrine on Earth. And then, the Soviets took that idea and turned it into a religion. The doctrine of Soviet armored warfare wasn't just tactical, it was philosophical. The idea of massed armor, thousands of tanks rolling in coordinated waves across vast terrain, was the spiritual backbone of Soviet military thinking. It wasn't enough to have tanks, you needed to flood the battlefield with them. Overwhelm the enemy, not with precision, but with volume, with iron, with mass. The T-34 became a cultural icon. The T-55, the T-62, the T-72. Each generation was a statement, a declaration that the Soviet Union had cracked the code of land warfare, and that any enemy facing the Red Army would be crushed beneath the weight of its armor. Russia inherited that doctrine, and for decades it worked, at least on paper. But something happened over the last 30 years that most Russian military planners either misread, downplayed, or simply refused to internalize. The battlefield quietly, systematically, and irreversibly shifted against the tank. It didn't happen overnight, it happened in layers. The first signal came in 1973, during the Yom Kippur War. Egyptian forces armed with Soviet-made Sagar anti-tank missiles devastated Israeli armor in the opening days of the conflict. Experienced Israeli tank crews, among the best trained in the world, found themselves helpless against missiles guided by soldiers lying flat in the desert. The kill ratios were staggering. Military analysts in Washington and Moscow both took note, but the lesson they drew was different. Western planners began accelerating investment in anti-armor technology and countermeasures. Soviet planners largely concluded the problem was Egyptian incompetence and Israeli overconfidence. They believed their own doctrine could absorb such losses. That was the first crack in the foundation. The second came slowly through the 1980s as man-portable anti-tank systems became cheaper, more accurate, and more lethal. The American TOW missile, the British Milan. Then, in the deserts of Afghanistan, something else emerged. The realization that a single soldier with the right weapon could kill a vehicle worth millions of dollars. That asymmetry, cheap kill versus expensive machine, was deeply uncomfortable for armies built around expensive machines. Russia ignored it, or rationalized it away. The third signal was the loudest, and it came in 1991 in the sands of Kuwait and Iraq. Operation Desert Storm lasted 100 hours on the ground. Coalition forces, armed with the M1 Abrams and equipped with advanced thermal imaging, night vision, and precision fire control, destroyed Iraqi armor, mostly Soviet-era tanks, at ratios that defied comprehension. Some engagements saw Iraqi T-72 crews unable to even acquire coalition targets before being hit. The lesson for anyone watching was simple and devastating. Armor alone meant nothing without information, integration, and precision. The T-72, the tank that formed the spine of Soviet armored doctrine, was exposed as deeply vulnerable when met with modern combined arms warfare. Russia watched. And still, the doctrine remained largely unchanged. Now we arrive at Ukraine. And this is where the story stops being historical and starts being something much harder to look at. In the weeks before February 2022, Russian armored columns assembled along the Ukrainian border in formations that look like something from a Cold War war game. Hundreds of tanks, artillery, infantry support vehicles. The sheer weight of Russian armor was supposed to accomplish in 72 hours what Soviet doctrine had always promised: shock, overwhelm, collapse. Kyiv would fall before the world had time to react. What happened instead became one of the most consequential military humiliations of the 21st century. Russian armored columns stalled on roads that turned to mud. Tanks ran out of fuel because logistics, the unsexy backbone of military power, had been neglected for decades while money flowed into hardware. Vehicles broke down due to poor maintenance. Crews, in some cases, abandoned functioning tanks because command and control had collapsed. And then, from the flanks, from tree lines, from apartment windows in towns that weren't supposed to resist, came the Javelin. The Javelin missile system changed this war in ways that are still being processed by every military on Earth. Here's what makes it so psychologically brutal for any tank crew facing it. The Javelin uses what's called fire and forget technology. The operator locks onto a target, fires, and then nothing. They can move, take cover, reposition. The missile guides itself. It doesn't need the operator to track the target. It doesn't need line of sight after launch. And it doesn't hit the tank from the front, where armor is thickest. It hits from above. A top attack trajectory that plunges directly into the thinnest part of the vehicle's armor, the roof of the turret. Russian tanks, including the T-72 and T-80, are catastrophically vulnerable to this attack profile. When the ammunition stored in the turret ignites, and it almost always does, the turret is blown entirely off the hull. Military analysts began calling it Jack-in-the-Box syndrome. Russian armor didn't just get destroyed in Ukraine, it got amputated. Turrets launched dozens of meters into the air, landing beside the burning hull of the tank they once sat upon. The imagery, and there has been a devastating amount of it, became a symbol of something far larger than a tactical failure. It became proof of concept. Tell us what you think in the comments. Do you believe the era of the main battle tank is truly over, or can these machines adapt? Because that question is exactly where this story gets complicated. The Russian military understands it has a problem. That much is no longer deniable. But the depth of that problem goes far beyond losing tanks in combat. It goes to the core of what happens when the foundational weapon of your entire military tradition is revealed to be acutely vulnerable to technology that costs a fraction of its price. A T-90M, Russia's most advanced operational tank, costs somewhere between $2 and $4 million. A Javelin missile system costs approximately $78,000 per launcher and around $40,000 per missile. The math is not complicated. And in Ukraine, that math has been calculated thousands of times in burning fields and shattered roads from Kharkiv to Kherson. Russia has lost more tanks in 2 years of fighting in Ukraine than the combined armored losses of every major NATO power over the last 3 decades. The exact figure is disputed, but open-source intelligence organizations tracking the conflict have documented the destruction of over 3,000 Russian armored vehicles using visual confirmation, images, video, geolocation. The real number is almost certainly higher. But here's what the numbers don't capture. The numbers don't capture what it does to a military institution when its central doctrine is publicly and repeatedly disproven in real time, on video, for the entire world to watch. The psychological dimension of this is something that most military analysts undervalue. Doctrine is not just strategy, it is identity. The Russian military has built its professional culture, its officer promotion systems, its strategic planning, its weapons procurement, and its national defense narrative around the supremacy of armored ground warfare. To admit that the tank is no longer the centerpiece of land combat is not just a tactical adjustment, it is an institutional identity crisis. It means decades of procurement decisions were wrong. It means the T-14 Armata, Russia's next-generation tank, unveiled with enormous fanfare in 2015, theoretically the most advanced tank in the world, may have arrived at precisely the moment when no tank, no matter how advanced, can survive a battlefield saturated with precision-guided anti-armor munitions, loitering drones, and networked kill chains. And the T-14 Armata, for all its theoretical capabilities, has barely appeared in combat. Russia has produced perhaps a few dozen. Some reports suggest mechanical and production problems have limited deployment significantly. The tank that was supposed to demonstrate Russia's continued mastery of armored warfare has become a kind of ghost, referenced constantly, seen almost never. Meanwhile, Ukraine's defenders have demonstrated something that is restructuring military planning rooms on every inhabited continent. The drone changes everything, not just in theory. In practice, every day, in ways that are visible and measurable and deeply alarming to any military still organized around expensive, heavy platforms. Ukrainian forces have used first-person view drones, commercial quadcopters modified to carry small explosive charges, to destroy tanks, armored vehicles, artillery positions, and supply lines at a cost that borders on incomprehensible. A drone capable of destroying a tank that costs $2 million can be purchased, modified, and deployed for less than $500. The ratio of destruction to investment has been inverted in a way that no military doctrine written in the 20th century fully anticipated. The implications of this are not lost on military planners in Washington, Beijing, Paris, or London. They are watching Ukraine not as an academic exercise, but as the most detailed, real-world stress test of military technology in decades. And what they are seeing is generating something close to quiet institutional panic. Because if the drone and the precision-guided missile have genuinely rendered the main battle tank obsolete as a dominant land warfare platform, not merely reduced its effectiveness, but fundamentally broken the doctrine built around it, then virtually every major military on Earth is holding an arsenal that requires radical rethinking. The United States has thousands of M1 Abrams. NATO allies operate Leopard 2s, Challenger 2s, Leclerc tanks. China has invested massively in its Type 99 and Type 15 platforms. India, South Korea, Japan all have built significant armored forces. All of these militaries are now watching Ukraine and asking a version of the same uncomfortable question. Is everything we've built still viable? For Russia, the question is not theoretical. It is existential and immediate. Because Russia is not watching this war from a distance, it is fighting it. And the feedback loop between what is happening on the battlefield and what Russian military planners are capable of doing about it is brutally compressed. Russia has responded to its armored losses in several ways. It has deployed older tanks from storage, Soviet-era vehicles pulled from warehouses, some in questionable condition, sent forward in an attempt to compensate for volume what has been lost in quality. It has attempted to add improvised protection to its vehicles, metal cages welded over turrets, designed to trigger the shaped charges in anti-tank missiles before they reach the tank's armor. Ukrainian soldiers began calling these cages cope cages. The name is not accidental. Because the cages do not work particularly well, they offer psychological reassurance more than genuine protection. And they represent something deeply revealing about the state of Russian armor adaptation: improvised, reactive, insufficient. Russia has also attempted to use tanks differently, pulling them back from direct combat roles, using them as indirect fire platforms rather than assault vehicles, hiding them behind terrain, and firing from hull-down positions. This is an acknowledgement, implicit but unmistakable, that the traditional Soviet doctrine of massed armor assault is no longer viable against an enemy equipped with modern anti-tank systems and drone surveillance. But adaptation has limits when the fundamental vulnerability is structural. The tank is large, it is heavy, it generates heat signatures visible to thermal imaging. It requires fuel. It requires roads or near-road terrain. It cannot hide from a drone looking down from above. And in a battlefield where drone surveillance is nearly omnipresent, where every movement of an armored column can be observed, tracked, and reported in near real time, the very qualities that once made tanks powerful have become liabilities. Mass is now a targeting signature. Speed is limited by terrain and fuel. Armor, while still protective against many threats, is no longer the near absolute defense it once appeared to be. What is emerging from Ukraine is not simply the obsolescence of one weapon system. It is the outline of an entirely different battlefield logic. A logic built on cheaper systems, distributed networks, precision over mass, and the ability to deny the enemy any predictable signature to target. In this emerging logic, the best defense against a drone is another drone, or an electronic warfare system, or decentralized dispersal that makes mass targeting impossible, not heavier armor. Russia is attempting to adapt its electronic warfare capabilities, jamming drone signals, developing countermeasures, deploying systems designed to blind Ukrainian drones. In some areas and some periods, these efforts have had meaningful effect. The electromagnetic battlefield is real, and Russian EW systems are genuinely capable. But Ukraine has consistently adapted, shifting frequencies, using different communication systems, developing new approaches faster than Russian countermeasures can lock them down. This adaptation cycle, attack, counter, counter-counter, is accelerating faster than any military bureaucracy, including Russia's, can comfortably manage. And Russia's military bureaucracy carries the additional burden of operating inside a system where bad news is structurally discouraged, where officers who accurately report failures risk career consequences, and where doctrine is protected by institutional identity rather than subjected to honest empirical evaluation. That combination, strategic vulnerability, institutional denial, and the psychological weight of watching your core doctrine fail in public, is producing something that goes beyond a tactical problem. It is producing a strategic identity crisis at the worst possible moment. Because beyond the tank question, beyond the drone question, beyond the anti-armor question, there is a larger reality beginning to crystallize for anyone watching this conflict with clear eyes. The Russian military that invaded Ukraine in February 2022 was built, funded, equipped, and trained for a vision of war that no longer exists in the form imagined. The vision of armored columns breaking through enemy lines, of massed artillery reshaping terrain, of infantry following armor into collapsed defensive positions, that vision is not dead. But it is profoundly wounded by what is happening in real time in Ukrainian fields and forests. And the armies that come after this war, the ones being designed right now in Pentagon war rooms, in Beijing's Central Military Commission, in European defense ministries that have suddenly found budget money they claimed they didn't have, those armies will look different. They will be built around lessons that are being written right now in Ukrainian blood and steel. Russia, uniquely, is being forced to absorb those lessons while still fighting the war that is teaching them. That is a nearly impossible strategic position. It is the military equivalent of trying to redesign an airplane while flying it through a storm. Subscribe to this channel and leave a like if you want to keep following this story, because what happens next in this conflict will determine not just the fate of Ukraine, but the shape of military power for the next generation. The tank is not entirely finished. Military history is full of technologies that were declared dead prematurely, then adapted and survived. But what is finished, irrevocably, demonstrably, on video evidence available to anyone with an internet connection, is the doctrine of the tank as the unchallenged centerpiece of land warfare. Russia built its military identity on that doctrine, and now it is watching that identity burn in the fields of a country it thought it would conquer in 3 days. The most dangerous moment for any military institution is not when it loses battles. Armies have lost battles and recovered throughout history. The most dangerous moment is when the foundational assumptions that the institution has organized itself around are proven wrong, not in a war game, not in a think tank study, but in a live war, on camera, with a price tag attached. Russia is in that moment now. And what comes out of it, the institutional response, the doctrinal reformation or the doctrinal doubling down, the technological adaptation or the continued reliance on mass and legacy, will define not just how this war ends, but what Russia's military becomes in the decade that follows. That transformation is already beginning, in ways that are not yet visible on any map or in any official statement. In the quiet conversations between Russian officers who have seen what they've seen, and who know, even if they cannot say it openly, that the army they trained for and the army they are fighting with are not the same thing. And that knowledge, locked inside an institution that punishes honesty, is perhaps the most dangerous weapon on this battlefield. Not in Russia's hands, against them. This story is not over, not by a long distance. In the next video, we're going to go deeper into what Russia's military is actually doing in response, the changes happening below the surface, the new doctrines being tested, and what it means for the next phase of this conflict. If you're not subscribed yet, do it now, because this is one of those moments where understanding what's really happening beneath the headlines, beneath the propaganda, beneath the official statements, matters more than almost anything else being covered right now. The battlefield is changing, and the armies that don't adapt to what Ukraine is teaching them will pay a price that no amount of armor can absorb.